Welcome to a fascinating journey into Carl Gustav Jung's tower in Bollingen. What secrets await in this mysterious place where mind and soul intertwine in an eternal dance of transformation? Join us as we explore the symbols adorning this sacred refuge, each with its own story and profound meaning. From the mandala to the eagle, from the serpent to the crystal-clear lake, each element invites us to delve into the world of the collective unconscious and discover the powers of the human psyche. Get ready for a unique experience full of revelations and deep reflections. Don't miss a single detail. Like this video, share the journey with your friends, and leave us your comments about what inspires you in this fascinating place. The journey to inner transformation is about to begin. At Bollingen, I'm at the center of my own life. I'm much more myself. At times I feel that I am part of the landscape and that I am inside things, that I am living in each tree, in the beating of the waves, in the clouds, in the animals that come and go, in the succession of the seasons, says Carl Gustav Jung. On one of my trips through old Europe, I visited the village of Bollingen, the place where the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung built his turn. Bollingen is a small village near Rapperswil in the canton of St. Gall, northeastern Switzerland. Due to its location, it is located on the northern shore of Lake Zurich and is part of the municipality of Jona. In it, a beautiful church stands out, the Wormsbach Abbey, which is a convent of nuns of the Cistercian order, founded in 1261, today the headquarters of a secondary school for girls. Currently, Bollingen has a cycle and pedestrian lane, which runs parallel to the train track and passes in front of Jung's plot. As I made my way to the Bollingen estate, I was thinking about the crowds of curious people who must have visited this place. He told me that this place seemed to have become a kind of pilgrimage center for those interested in the life of the Swiss psychiatrist C.G. Jung. At the same time, I wondered if those who visit him have not made this extraordinary person their particular messiah, thus projecting the archetypal image of the Redeemer. From my point of view, the primary aim of all Jung's work is to enable the individual to make contact with the creative source of his own inner world, the psyche, a world from which spring symbolic images full of meaning and meaning essential to psychic health and destiny, both of the individual and of the collective of which the individual is a part. In this way, if one continues Jung's genuine legacy, one will go to one's own unconscious, make contact with the spirits of one's ancestors, archetypes, Jung calls them, and find in them the guidance that one's consciousness needs. He will become aware, he will experience in himself what Jung did in life in his Bollingen Tower, that is, the contact of his consciousness with the unconscious, after the necessary descent of the mental level, practicing the active imagination and differentiating, more and more, that function that generates symbols, which Jung called the transcendent function. I thought to myself that continuing Jung's legacy is not, as many believe, learning his works by heart and, like clever monkeys, repeating them ad nauseum, showing off how well one reproduces the contents of his works. While reading Jung's work is important, in the sense of being a conditio sine qua non, what is really important lies in the realization of one's own individuation, for which it is necessary to have an appropriate place in which to devote one's entire life to realizing, that is, making reality, the red book of each one, where to give birth to the divinity in one's own depth. There, in the interiority of the psyche, God becomes fruitful. But the experience with the archetypes, with the spirits of our ancestors, is too onerous, tremendously humiliating for the modern consciousness, which has set itself up as the mistress and mistress of the world and of the soul. And the fact is that what they say to us, indicate us, show us, reveal us on many occasions, breaks with the image of the world of consciousness. And, more often than not, one is faced with situations that will be terrible to the ego. For example, an encounter with the shadow archetype will reveal, or can unveil, the potential murderer or criminal that one might become, if conditions are ripe for such a killer to emerge. And this, for the ego, is humiliating. Similarly, the anima archetype, for example, can show us that our attitude toward women in particular and toward the feminine in general is inadequate. And this experience is, for the ego, very humiliating. Or, an experience with the unconscious can teach us that the ego is just a tiny, tiny light, like the flame of a candle, in the vast immensity of our inner and or outer world. And this, for a modern conscience is tremendously humiliating. Having made this digression, I return to my visit to the Bollingen Tower. About the construction of the tower at Bollingen, Jung says the following in Memories, Dreams, Thoughts in page 230. Through scientific work, I gradually established my fantasies and the themes of the unconscious on solid ground. However, words and paper were not enough for me. I needed something more. I had to reproduce in stone my innermost ideas and my own knowledge, or make a confession in stone. Such was the beginning of the tower I built for myself in Bollingen. Jung had always been fascinated by the northern shore of Lake Zurich, so as soon as he had raised enough money to buy the land in Bollingen in 1922, he bought it. This land is located in the region of St. Meinrad. The site belonged to the monastery of St. Gall and, apparently, before this, other temples were already built on that site. So, from what we see, the location of the area is related to its peculiar characteristics. Jung originally planned the construction of a single-story building, with a hearth in the center, the bedrooms on the sides, next to the walls of the dwelling, without electricity or running water, taking inspiration from the African huts where the fire burns in the center and the life of the whole family, the animals, etc., unfolds around that center. However, he soon realized that the house was too primitive for him. Thus, he first built the circular tower in 1923. For Jung, this tower meant a kind of maternal womb of the goddess, a carved form of cave, or, also, the maternal womb of a virgin. However, with the passage of time he realized that this building, the keep, did not represent the totality of his psychic edifice, which still had more to manifest. And in 1927, after 4 years of work, he built a new circular building, an annex. A short time later, Jung had the feeling that those constructions were still too primitive, and in 1931, 4 years later, the annex was converted into a second tower. In this second tower, he reserved a space exclusively for himself of Indian inspiration, where he could retire to meditate, that is, to carry out the incubation or tapas. In this isolated room he was alone with himself, and no one could enter it without his permission. He always jealously guarded the key in his possession. There, over the years, Jung painted the walls in his eagerness to express, in this way, the images that sprouted in his isolation, exercising a meditation technique that he called active imagination, which is a purification of the imaginatio vera et no fantastica of the alchemist opus. That is why that room, as he himself says, constitutes a prism of meditations and imaginations, often very unpleasant meditations and very difficult thoughts, a place of spiritual concentration where one can get in touch with eternity. Joseph Campbell explains the meaning of this construction as follows. The place where a hero was born, where he has performed his deeds, or where he has returned into the void, is marked out and sanctified. A temple is erected there, with which the miracle of perfect centrality is signified and inspired, because this is the place where abundance begins. Because someone, in this case Carl G. Jung, in this place discovered eternity. Therefore, this place can serve as a support for fruitful meditation. For years later, Jung again felt the need to express the existence of something more, and built a loggia and a courtyard next to the lake, which symbolized a space that opened up to nature and the sky. These constructions constituted a quarter of the architectural ensemble and were separated from the triple main complex. The middle wing, concealed between the two towers, represented for Jung his own self, so he raised a second floor to this building, thus representing the supremacy of consciousness over the whole edifice, attained in old age. Notice that, in this way, the entire building is made up of 4 different wings, built over the course of 12 years, which manifests a clear solar symbology. By the way, the symbology that permeates my novel The Brotherhood of the Initiates shares solar symbolism with the construction of Jung's house. And, something very interesting, I used, without knowing these facts at the time, the same symbolism for the chapters and sections of my book The Return to Paradise Lost, The Renewal of a Culture. For me, these 2 books are something like the 2 towers of my intellectual edifice. However, the construction of the Bollingen building came about as if it were a mandala. That is, there was no conscious intention to do so. Rather, it emerged, in a creative act, just as it arose for Jung. In the same way, When I write a book, I don't know in advance whether it will be a novel, an essay, or a hybrid. It just arises as it arises. Jung puts it this way in Memories, Dreams, Thoughts. I built the house in isolated parts and always followed the respective concrete needs. I never thought about intimate connections. You could say that I built the keep in a kind of dream. Only later did I see what had emerged and that it had a reasonable form, a symbol of psychic integrity. It had developed as if an old seed had germinated. And, as J. Campbell states, such a temple is usually built by simulating the four directions of the world's horizon, and the shrine or altar in the center, Jung's turn, is the symbol of the inexhaustible point. That inexhaustible point, Jung, using Eastern terminology, would call the self. Jung would probably agree with interpreting the meaning of his temple house in Bollingen, as expressed by J. Campbell when referring to the sacred precincts, including his castle temple in the village of Bollingen, surrounded by nature and on the shore of Lake Zurich. Hence, he goes on to say, at Bollingen I'm in my own essence, as far as I'm concerned. Here I am, as it were, the primitive son of the mother. This is wisely said in alchemy, for the primitive, whom I experienced as a child, is personality number 2 who has always lived and will live, the spirit of the deep, he calls it elsewhere. It is on the margins of time, and is the child of the maternal unconscious. In my fantasies, the primitive took the form of Philemon, and in Bollingen he is alive. Philemon is, for Jung, the symbolic image of the archetype of the old sage, whose parallel in Arthurian legends would be Merlin. Wisdom comes from this archetype, from the self, which represents the center and at the same time the totality of the psyche, and never from the I, as the center of consciousness, which, in order not to incur inflation, must adopt towards the old sage, the primitive, the attitude of the pure eternus, always ready to learn. He who regards this primitive old elder as egocentric projects the situation in which his conscious self finds itself onto the figure of the wise elder, thereby incurring a serious inflation. The fall from the top of the tower, something that is very well represented in the major arcana number 16 of the Tarot of Marseilles, which is called the Tower, is the fate that awaits an ego in such a state. A situation, by the way, that has led our expensive westernized civilization to the serious crisis of values in which the world is plunged and, as an expression of this inner crisis, to the ecological and economic crises. The tombstone of the tower. In 1950, while he was building the separation wall of the garden, for which he needed stones, he ordered these from a nearby quarry. The builder dictated the exact measurements to the stonemason, and he wrote them down in a notebook, so there was no hint of confusion. But when the stones came to him in a ship and he had unloaded them on land, the builder was indignant, because they had made a mistake. So, he ordered the stone to be taken away immediately and to bring the one he had requested. But Jung, seeing the stone, told them that he wanted it, that it was their cornerstone. Instead of having 3 edges, as they had requested, this rejected stone had 4. It was a hexahedron of much larger dimensions than the builder had asked the stonemason for. That anecdote reminded Jung of an apothegm of the alchemist Arnaud Villanova, which appears in his work entitled The Rosary of the Philosophers, and which reads as follows. Hic lapis excellis extat, pretio quoque vilis.
Spernitur a stultis, amatur plus ab edoctis.
It means, here's the stone, the insignificant one. It's certainly worth little in the way of price. It will be despised by the ignorant, but all the more loved by the wise. Or, again, this insignificant stone has hardly any value. Fools despise it while wise men covet it. These words of Arnaldo Villanova refer to the lapis, the philosopher's stone, which the ignorant reject and despise. A text that reminds us of the one that appears in Matthew 21 verse 42 and Psalm 118 verse 22, foreshadowing this anecdote of Jung, and which goes like this. The stone that the builders rejected became the head and corner of the building, the cornerstone. That is the work of the Lord, wonderful in our eyes. On the front surface of the stone, Jung sculpted a small circle that simulated a looking eye and, in the center, as a pupil, he placed a small man, a Kabir or Telesphorus, son of Asclepius Aesculapius, covered by a coat and a hood, carrying a lamp. In the center of this homunculus appears a symbol, that of the alchemical astrological Mercury, which indicates the central place of Hermes Mercury in the alchemical work of the union of opposites, of the sun and the moon, being a kind of guide or psychopomp in what Jung called the process of individuation, a process which, like the alchemical work, leads to the fullest realization of the individual. Hence, on the stone, are chiseled the symbols of the 7 planets known in antiquity, the Sun and Jupiter in conjunction on the right, Venus and the Moon on the left, Saturn above the little man and Mars just below. To this mercurial figure, Jung dedicated several words, which welled up in his mind as he sculpted it. Time as a child, playful as a child, playing chess, the kingdom of the child. This is Telesphorus, who traverses the dark regions of this cosmos and shines like a star from the depths. It points the way to the gates of the sun and the land of dreams. The first phrase belongs to Heraclitus, the second alludes to the liturgy of Mithras, and the last is from Canto 24, verse 12, of Homer's Odyssey. In accordance with the symbolic process represented in alchemy by the transformation of lead into gold, which is what Jung's engraving on his tombstone seems to allude to, as a symbol of the individual's enlightenment or salvation, alchemist opera takes place in 4 essential phases, represented by 4 colors. Nigredo, or blackening, whose color is black and is related to Saturn, black bile, which is the stage of purgation of the desires of the flesh, the feelings of guilt, the origin or raw material, in which the unmanifested energies are contained. Albedo, whitening, or baptism, which is the first magisterium or little mystery, where the first transformation takes place. Rubedo, redness represented by sulfur and related to the planet Jupiter and the Sun. Note that both planets are grouped on the same side, on the stone, dominated by passion or amor. Finally, the appearance of gold. The first operation that takes place in the alchemical process, as stated by one Eduardo Serlet in his Dictionary of Symbols, is the so-called calcinatio or calcination of matter, which symbolically represents the death of the profane, of the individual identified with the manifest world and plunged into a state of ignorance and stupidity. Or putrefactio corresponds to the separation of the destroyed elements, the purging of the instincts and desires for the goods of this world. The solutio, or solution, expresses the purification of the raw material. Destillatio is the distillation of purified matter, that is, the separation of the factors that will lead to enlightenment or salvation. The conjunctio, or coincidentia oppositorum, as an internal union of the opposite principles, masculine and feminine, or consciousness and unconscious. The sublimatio symbolizes the phase of suffering derived from the dedication to the work and from the experience of the mystical split of the world, symbolized by the myth of Prometheus and by the struggle of the winged dragon, heaven, and the wingless dragon, earth. The last operation is coagulatio, coagulation or reunion into an inseparable unity of the 2 contrary principles, the fixed and the volatile, the masculine and the feminine, the ephemeral and the everlasting. This alchemical evolution is summed up in the maxim solve et coagula, which implies the importance of analyzing, separating, splitting, or dissolving all that is inferior in the human soul, even if one has to break oneself, in part, in doing so. Subsequently, the coagulation or union of what is separated and previously purified takes place in the previous operation. From this it follows that the being that one is at the beginning of the process is transformed into another one entirely. Thus the corporeal man that one was is transformed into the spiritual man, nay, he is transformed into the duplex, androgynous being, a being that is both material and spiritual. The individual thus conceived spiritualizes matter and materializes spirit, observes what happens in the material world as if it were a symbolic representation of the archetypal world, and embodies or manifests the spiritual messages he receives from the unconscious. This process of individuation, as a spiritual impulse in the human being, seems to seek the realization of the totality of the individual. Hence, Javier Meloni, in his book The Christ Within, states the following. The knowledge of the truth is revealed as an adventure that involves the totality of the person. That is why truth transforms, because it reaches the root where our perception of reality is formed. But that truth is just beginning. Living truly frees us from the different dependencies that block our potential. On the third face, facing the lake, Jung let the lapis express itself within it, that is, the center, the self, and sculpted the following. I'm an orphan, I'm alone, yet I am found everywhere. I am a unit, but opposed to myself. I am young and old at the same time. I have known neither father nor mother, because I had to be pulled out of the depths like a fish, or because I fell from the sky like a white stone. I wander through forests and mountains, but I am hidden in the depths of man. I am mortal like everyone else, yet I am not affected by the course of time. To conclude, he placed the following words under Arnaldo de Villanova's verse on the first face he carved. See the first image. In memoriam nat, ivitati he s dii, lxxvcg Jung ex grat, itudine, fec, it, etpos, ut, a, nn, omcml. In memory of its 75th anniversary, C.G. Jung has made and placed it in 1950 in thanksgiving. This stone tombstone is placed outside the tower, and Jung considered it a kind of manifestation of what it meant to him. A manifestation of its inhabitant, who remains, however, misunderstood by men. This stone tombstone, the embodiment of the lapis philosophorum, is a manifestation of the Christ within, an expression of what Jung called the self, the archetype of the totipotential unity, of Tao as the archetype of the ultimate meaning of existence. The video was filmed in the summer of 1950 by filmmaker and composer Jerome Hill at Bollingen Keep. Jung reads what he himself has just sculpted in the Bollingen stone, the cubic sculpture he created that year on the occasion of his 75th birthday, and which sums up everything we have said in this essay. To conclude this essay, I would like to mention here that, in order to understand what archetypes are, and their effects on matter and spirit, the soul and the world, the realm of abstraction, which is so dear to the function of thought, will never grasp its elusive essence. As elusive as is one of its most conspicuous symbols, the fish. To get a glimpse of what an archetype is, understood in the Jungian sense, requires experience and the function of intuition. Thought, once it has experienced the archetype and grasped its essence through the intermediary of intuition, can begin to describe and analyze what it has experienced. Without these previous steps, experience, psychic facts, and intuition, which sees beyond the object, it will never be possible to understand what an archetype is. Hence, all philosophical reflection never succeeds in understanding what an archetype is. It's like describing and analyzing a territory without ever having been there. Of course, the descent into hell that access to the unconscious entails takes place through the lower function of consciousness, which is that which communicates it with the unconscious. When I refer to the importance of intuition and, above all, of experience, I emphasize that, after the descent into hell, as happens to Jung in his confrontation with the unconscious through the function of sensation, it is subsequently the higher functions, intuition and thought, that perform the Herculean task of understanding the experienced. In the captivating journey through the video, we've delved into the intricate symbols that inhabit Carl Gustav Jung's tower in Bollingen, unveiling layers of profound meaning and mystery. From the mandala, a powerful representation of wholeness and the integration of self, to the philosopher's stone, the alchemical symbol of spiritual transformation and the quest for inner truth, each element immerses us in a journey towards deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. The tower itself, with its unique architecture and its connection to the surrounding nature, becomes a symbol of the human psyche and its pursuit of balance and harmony. Furthermore, as we explore the cubic stone lying in Bollingen, we encounter a rich array of alchemical symbols that invite us to reflect on the processes of transformation and purification we undergo on our journey towards individuation. Each symbol, from the sun to the moon, from the eagle to the serpent, offers us a window into the collective unconscious and guides us on our path towards self-realization and spiritual fulfillment. At the end of the journey, we emerge with a greater understanding of ourselves and the world we inhabit, inspired by the profound wisdom residing in the symbols of the Bollingen Tower.